U.S. Army Air Force B-25B Mitchell medium bomber, one of 16 involved in the mission, takes off from the flight deck of the USS Hornet for an air raid on the Japanese home islands on April 18, 1942. The attack, later known as the Doolittle Raid, inflicted limited damage but gave a huge boost to American morale after the attacks on Pearl Harbor months earlier. The events of 1942 were crucial in the way that World War II played out. A crew member checks the lashings on his bomber aboard the USS Hornet, while behind him other crews checked their planes in preparation for the Doolittle Raid on April 18, 1942. The first Americans arrived in England in January, overpaid, oversexed and over here as the gripe went, and in North Africa Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps began their counter-offensive, capturing Tobruk in June. Posing in front of a bomber is crew number 1 of the Doolittle Raid, from the 34th Bombardment Squadron, Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, pilot, second from left, Lieutenant Richard E. Cole, co-pilot, Lieutenant Henry A. Potter, navigator, SSGT. Fred A. Bremer, bombardier, SSGT. Paul J. Leonard, flight engineer gunner. The Blitz intensified in both England and Germany, with the first 1,000-bomber air raid on Cologne and German bombing of British cathedral cities. American B-25B bombers rest on the flight deck of the USS Hornet, approaching the spot where the planes were launched on their raid on Tokyo, April 13, 1942. Escort ship in left background. In the Pacific, the Japanese continued their expansion into Borneo, Java, and Sumatra. A U.S. Army Air Force B-25B bomber leaves the deck of the USS Hornet for the historic raid on Tokyo under Major Gen. James Doolittle on April 18, 1942. Each aircraft carried 3 500-pound high explosive bombs and 1 incendiary bomb. The unassailable British fortress of Singapore fell rapidly in February, with around 25,000 prisoners taken, many of whom would die in Japanese camps in the years to follow. Above Tokyo, smoke rises from strikes on the Japanese mainland as the bombs dropped by Doolittle's raiders hit their targets on April 18, 1942. Unable to land the huge aircraft back on the USS Hornet and running low on fuel, the bombers continued westward attempting to land in a friendly area in China. But June saw the peak of Japanese expansion. Ryozo Asano, left, spokesman for a group of diversified Japanese family enterprises called the Zaibatsu, inspects the wreckage of his steel plant in Tokyo after the first U.S. air raid on Japan's capital, April 18, 1942. He is accompanied by an unidentified aide. 13 targets were struck, including an oil tank farm, a steel mill, and an aircraft carrier under construction. Some 50 Japanese lost their lives. The Battle of Midway, in which U.S. sea-based aircraft destroyed 4 Japanese carriers and a cruiser, marked the turning point in the Pacific War. 4 unidentified Doolittle raid crewmen, who bailed out over China from aircraft number 14, are escorted in a Chinese village before being reunited with other airmen in April of 1942. Most of the crew members made it to China, either crash landing or bailing out over land. The assistance given by the Chinese to the airmen spurred the Japanese Imperial Army to carry out a retaliatory action called the Zhejiang-Jiangxi Campaign. Over the course of 4 months, entire villages were destroyed, and an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians were killed. The second half of the year also saw a reversal of German fortunes. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, who led the April 1942 air raid on Tokyo addresses a throng of aircraft workers at the North American aviation plant on June 1, 1942. He said that Shangri-La, the mythical land identified by President Roosevelt as the place where the bombers came from, is right here in this North American plant. British forces under Montgomery gained the initiative in North Africa at El Alamein, and Russian forces counterattacked at Stalingrad. The village of Lidice, Czechoslovakia, before it was burned to the ground by the Germans in 1942. On May 27, 1942, a high-ranking Nazi official named Reinhard Heydrich was assassinated, and soon after, Adolf Hitler himself reportedly ordered that any village found harboring the assassins should be leveled, all male residents executed, females shipped off to concentration camps, and acceptable children given to German families. The village of Lidice, reportedly home to Czech resistance fighters, was chosen, and Hitler's orders were carried out starting on June 10, 1942, when all 192 men over 16 years of age were executed. The news of mass murders of Jewish people by the Nazis reached the Allies, and the US pledged to avenge these crimes. A gun-coupled camera aboard a British RAF Spitfire plane made this record of a German Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighter aircraft getting shot down in May 1942 over an unknown location. In this article you'll find an amazing and rare photo collections of the raids of the Second World War. Appalling conditions ruling on the Russian front following the thaw, when the winter snows melted and resulted in widespread floods on May 23, 1942. German soldiers wade through icy water which is knee-deep somewhere in Russia. American B-25B bombers rest on the flight deck of the USS Hornet, approaching the spot where the planes were launched on their raid on Tokyo, April 13, 1942. Sergeant P. Dorzev, a Russian sniper who killed 181 Germans on the Leningrad front, looking through binoculars and holding a rifle sometime in 1942. Escort ship in left background. This photo was taken from the body of a dead Germany officer killed in Russia, showing a German firing squad shooting Soviet civilians in the back as they sit beside their own mass grave in Babi Yar, an infamous ravine in the Ukrainian capital of Kiev, in 1942. Between 1941 and 1942, an estimated 100,000 to 150,000 Jews, Soviet prisoners, communists, gypsies, Ukrainian nationalists and civilians were executed by the Germans in Babi Yar. Photo credit, AP. Russian troops approach Moscow with German prisoners on February 10, 1942.